Hello and good day to you. My name is Dr. Obafemi Oyewumi, and I'm delighted to have you here once again, being part of this particular class. Today, is the part 3, the third part of what we started, some 3 editions ago, and we are concluding on overheads, today. In the time past, we considered the topics like the meaning of overhead. We also talked about allocation. We talked about classification. We talked about collection of overheads, and of course, we also talked about apportionment of overhead. So today we are going to part 3 of our discourse on overheads, and I want to appeal that if you are yet to subscribe to my channel, please go ahead and do just that now, so that you can always be part of whatever it is that we'll be able to bring up from time to time relating to cost accounting. So I welcome you once again. Okay, so please subscribe and be part of this particular channel. And I trust that you'll be able to learn more, concerning what we're about to discuss today. So we're about to start now. Let me share my screen so that you can be part of the class proper. All right. So accounting for overheads, and of course we have the balance absorption. Absorption is what we're looking at today. So simply put, we're talking about absorption of overhead costs. So that's what we are looking at today. Okay, so let's move on as we talked about it. Now let's look at the learning objectives, things that we have to learn by virtue of what we're here to do. Unless we're saying that at the end of this class, you have understanding of the meaning of overhead absorption. Okay, we talk about steps that you have to take in order for you to absorb overhead, and of course the basis for calculating overhead absorption rate. Of course, we're talking about the concept of over and under absorption of overhead, and of course you need to understand the reason why we have overhead, over or under absorption of overhead. What is the meaning of absorption overhead? Absorption of overhead. Now, the meaning is simply put, when we talk about the cost of a particular product, we talk about the direct cost, and we talk about the indirect cost. We covered this in the time past. Okay, the indirect costs are basically the overheads. So it means that the cost of a particular product is not known until the overheads are actually also accounted for and are also added to the production, to the cost of the product. Now, when we talk about, for example, we talk about rent. Rent is an overhead. All right, because the period cost. Now, if the rent is about 10,000 naira, for example, you cannot just pick that rent and say 10,000 naira will be added, to the cost of a product, a particular unit of particular unit. You can't say you want to add that same value to it just like that. So how do you bring in overhead into the cost of the product? So that's why we're talking about overhead absorption today. So what's overhead absorption? Overhead absorption is the process whereby overhead costs are allocated and apportioned, overhead costs allocated and apportioned to production costs are added to unit, job, or batch costs. So it means that it is a process by which you recover. It's a process by which you bring in the cost of your overheads and adding it to the total cost of production. That is what it entails. That's what it means. So overheads are usually added to cost units using a predetermined absorption rate, which is calculated using figures from the budget. So that's what overhead is all about. The overhead absorption is all about. Let's look at the steps that you have to take in order for you to absorb your overheads. Number one, you need to estimate the likely amounts to be incurred, the amount to be incurred, during the period that you are trying, that you are dealing with. Okay. Number two is also to establish the level of activity. Okay, this could be in total, in the number of hours. It could be production units, it could be direct cost, or whatever it is upon which the overhead absorption rate is to be based. Okay, right? Apportion rate to be based. So number three is to divide the estimated overhead, which you calculated in number one. Okay, estimated overhead by the budgeted activity level. So that will give you what is called overhead absorption rate. And then number four, we're now to use the overhead absorption rate to absorb overhead into the cost unit, by applying the overhead, the calculated overhead absorption rate. So that is talking about what you have to use in order for you to achieve your purpose of absorbing overhead into the cost of production. of each unit of product. So the overhead absorption rate, that's calculated as such. Look at what we have here. Budgeted overhead divided by the volume of activity. Budgeted overhead divided by the volume of activity. So the volume of activity now could be labor hours, could be machine hours, could be number of production units. That's what we're referring to as volume of activity. Okay, so let's move on to the basis. What are the bases, for calculating? Basis to be used in order for you to arrive at your overhead absorption. There's several bases. There's several bases for you to calculate, overhead absorption rate, depending on the nature of the business. Okay, if the nature of the business is usually based on human, capital. Okay, if predominantly you exert much from human capital, then you begin to talk about direct labor hours. For example, if your production process or if your business has to do with use of machines and all of that, then you begin to talk about machine hours. Okay, so there are different bases that depend on the type of depend on the type or nature of the business that you are involved in, or the business is involved in. So we have different bases here. But one is percentage of material costs, which is arrived at by calculating in this way: budgeted overhead divided by direct material costs times 100%. Percentage of direct labor costs is arrived at by dividing the budgeted overhead by the direct labor cost and multiplying it by 100%. Percentage of prime cost is arrived at by calculating, budgeted overhead by dividing budgeted overhead by prime cost and then multiplying by 100%. A percentage of factory cost is also arrived at, when you pick the budgeted overhead and divide it by the factory cost and then multiply it by 100%. A percentage of sales cost, is to be arrived at by dividing budgeted overhead by sales cost multiplied by 100%. And then the other variants are rates per machine hours, rates per direct labor hours, and then rates per production units. Okay, those are the different bases of calculating overhead absorption rate. Let's look at this question to illustrate what we've been talking about, since. Okay, where Press Ventures makes two products, the Greek and the Roman. Greeks take 2 hours, 2 labor hours each to make, and Romans take 5 labor hours. The budgeted overhead cost is 50,000 naira, and the budgeted activity level is 100 labor hours. What is the overhead cost per unit for Greeks and Romans, respectively, if overheads are absorbed based on labor hours? Now, in this particular question, we have the budgeted overhead, which is 50,000 naira. And then we also have the budgeted activity level, which is 100,000 labor hours. So we have our budgeted figures, overhead cost, and then budgeted activity. Now we're being asked what will be the overhead cost per unit for Greeks and then for Romans. Okay, if these overheads are absorbed based on labor hours. Let's look at the suggested solutions here. So ascertain the budgeted overhead, which we did earlier on, okay, based on the steps that we talked about. So the steps to ascertain: first, the budgeted overhead, which is 50,000, ascertain the volume or basis, which is 100,000 labor hours, okay, and then calculate the overhead absorption rate by dividing budgeted overhead by the volume. So multiply the overhead absorption rate, OAR, by the actual number of labor hours spent on each product. So that is how to arrive at our overhead absorption rate. So how do we arrive at overhead absorption rate now? We have 50,000 naira divided by 100,000, and then you're going to be arriving at 0.5 naira. That is 50 cobas for our Nigerian naira, okay, per direct labor hours, So overhead cost for Greeks would then be, since we are using 2 hours for Greeks, Okay, this is supposed to be for Romans. Please pardon me. Here, this is supposed to be for Romans. Okay, let's go back to what we have. So here we say that for Greek will take 2 hours, and then for Romans will take 5 hours. So this one has to do with it means that this particular one we figure out to this name will have to be changed to Romans. Okay, that's what that is telling us basically. So let me quickly just make that correction, okay, so that we can have an idea of what we are talking about. So I've changed it to Romans. Okay, there. All right. So let's move on to let's go back to our presentation mode. So we have overhead cost for Romans now is 0.5 times 5. Okay, that will give you 2 naira 50 kobo. So per unit of Romans, we have 2 naira 50 kobo, and then per unit of Greeks, we have 1 naira. Okay, so that's how to calculate the overhead absorption rate, and then of course knowing the amount to be added to the cost of the production of Greeks and Romans as it were. So let's go and move on to this another illustration. Foundation Limited Company has 2 services. Okay, 2 service departments, and then 2 production departments. Information for each department for 2015 is as follows. Let's look at this information. So we have overhead cost 180, 120, 460, 540 for assembly, molding, okay, and then 80 and 120 for admin and maintenance. So 2 service units and then 2 production units. All right. So we have direct labor hours for falling under recorded under each department or each each department now. Okay, 500 for admin for the service department, and then 2,000 for maintenance in the service department. 25,000 okay hours, and then 2,000 hours for molding and assembly departments of production, and then machine hours we have 200, 300, and then we have 6,000, 12,000. A number of employees 0 for admin, and then 500 for maintenance, and then 2,005 or 10,000 for assembly. So required to calculate the overhead recovery rate, okay, for each of the production department using the 3 bases. So let's go ahead and see the solution. So for direct labor hours, we have 460,000. That's the projected overhead. Remember the overhead, given to us, according to the question, divided by 25,000 direct labor hours. Okay, and then for assembly, we have 540,000 divided by 32,000 direct labor hours given to us in this question, 25 and 32. Okay, so there we have the figures given to us there. The calculation is what we have here. That means that for direct labor hours here, the overhead will be absorbed, of a overhead of 8,014 kobo, 8 naira 40 kobo will be added as direct labor as overhead. Okay, that's the overhead. That's the amount to be recovered from the overheads. For assembly, we have 540 divided by 32, and then that will give you 16 naira 88 kobo. That's the per direct labor hour. So that's what we're going to also be absorbing, based on the question that we're solving. Machine hours. Okay, we have for molding 460. 540 divided by 12. The matter is talking about the number of machine hours, and then assembly we talk about 6,000. That will also give you 40,000, 19 naira, while the other one will give you 38 naira. Okay, number of employees. So for molding, we have 460 divided by 2,005, then 540 divided by 10,000, and that will give you 184 per each employee, and if it's 4 per the employee that we have in assembly. So that's the solution to be given, in that particular question. Let's look at over and under absorption of overheads. I believe that this is the question that we're trying to solve is clear enough, here for us to actually appreciate the basis and how to calculate our overhead absorption rate. Okay, so let's go to over and under as absorption of overhead. Okay, we're saying here that it's possible for your overhead to be under or over absorbed. because we are looking at budgeted figures. So when we are calculating our overhead absorption rate, we're actually looking at it based on, budgeted figures. There is a difference between the budget that there's every likelihood that your budgeted overhead will be different from the actual. If the budgeted is the same thing as actual, then we'll not have any over or under absorption of overhead. But the moment you begin to use budgeted figures, that means that at the end of you have to compare what you have budgeted, with your actual. So over and under absorption overhead, of course, because the predetermined overhead absorption rates are based on estimates. It's likely that actual overhead will not agree with budgeted overheads. So when does overhead over absorption occurs? This means that overhead absorbed to the cost of sales are greater than the actual overhead incurred. Okay, it means that the costs that the overhead has been absorbed into the cost will be much more or greater than the actual overhead incurred. So overhead absorption will definitely increase, over absorption will definitely increase, your profit. Okay. Meanwhile, under absorption, this means that the overhead absorbed into the cost of sales is less than the actual overhead incurred. And that means that under absorption will reduce your profit. So let's look at the reasons. Why do we have over or under or over absorption of overheads? Number one, actual overhead costs are different from budgeted overhead costs. I said that earlier on, where actual overhead incurred is different from the budgeted. Then you'll have a case of under either or over absorbed overhead. Then the second one is actual activity level, where actual activity level is different from the budgeted activity level. There's also a likelihood that you have the same scenario, this cost. I mean, this under or over absorption of overhead. Then the last one is when the actual overhead cost and actual activity level differ from the budgeted cost and activity level. So those are the reasons why we have under or over absorption of overheads. So let's look at this example to illustrate what we've been talking about concerning under or over absorption of overhead. Suppose that the budgeted overhead in the production process is 80,000 and the budgeted activity is 40,000 direct labor hours. So the budgeted overhead here is 80,000 and then the budgeted activity level is 40,000. Okay, actual overhead incurred in the course of the same period is 84,000 naira and 45,000 direct labor hours. Okay, so is there any over or under absorption overhead here? That's the question. If yes, how much? So let's look at the suggested answer. So say we have to calculate the overhead absorption rate, multiply the outcome in A by the activity level, which is 45,000, deduct the outcome of B from the budgeted overhead. So those are the steps to follow. So let's look at our overhead absorption rate. That means we're going to divide 80,000 by 40,000. That will give you 2 naira per direct labor hour. So as overhead, we're going to multiply your 45,000, 45,000 by by 2. This is supposed to be 45,000 direct labor hours, okay, multiplied by 2 naira as a matter of fact. So let me just quickly just adjust this. So this is should give us 2 naira and not the other way around. Okay, so not the other way around. So what we are going to have is this. So our 2 naira will actually come, here. So here we have 45 direct labor hours multiplied by 2 naira, and then that will give you 90,000 naira. So that is the amount of overhead that you have absorbed. Okay, so now you want to deduct the actual amount absorbed, from the budgeted, okay, overhead that you calculated earlier on. So here we now have 90,000, that's absorbed overhead, minus 84, and that will give you 6,000, as over absorption, So that's how to calculate our to know whether you have, overhead absorbed or otherwise. So the That means this is absorbed overhead, but then this is the actual overhead, and then you have over-absorption of 6,000 naira. So let's go to the next slide where we talk about another example. So the budget overhead of a company is 64,000, while the budgeted unit of production units of production are 8,000. Actual result for the period is as follows. Actual production, in total is 75,000 units, or there are 75,000 units, and then actual overhead cost is in line with the budget. So what is the over or under absorption of overhead? So here, first thing you have to do is to calculate the overhead absorption rate, which is 64,000 divided by 8,000. That's the budgeted figures, okay? The budgeted overhead and the budgeted units. So that will give you 8 naira per unit. Overhead absorbed based on activity level. Now, activity level, the actual activity level was 75. So add multiply 75 by 8, you have given 60,000. So here we have under absorption because this figure that you have absorbed into the system. This figure you have absorbed into the system, whereas you have budgeted 64,000 naira. So here we're talking about on and under absorption of 4,000, naira. So let's look at another example. We'll just wrap up with this concerning this particular topic. Okay, this moment, budgeted overhead cost of 50,000 and budgeted activity level of 25,000 are in place. Calculate the over or under absorption of overhead and give reason for the over under absorption in the following instances. Okay, so we have actual overhead is 47,000. So we have 3 scenarios here. Actual overhead cost 47,000 and 25,000 direct labor hours are worked. Okay, actual overhead, that's the second scenario, cost 50,000 and then 21,500 direct labor hours at work. Actual overhead cost 47,000 and 21,000 for 500 direct labor hours at work. So let's look at the solution, suggested solutions here. So for scenario A, absorb overhead for activity level of 25,000 direct labor hours. So you're going to calculate first and foremost the overhead absorption rate. Okay, that's the first point. Overhead absorption rate 50,000 divided by 25 will give you 2 naira per direct labor hour. 2 naira per direct labor hour. So we now, in this case, we're going to be having, overhead absorption, over absorption, because overhead absorption, we're having over absorption. So let's look at how we arrive at this. The absorbed for this level, we're talking about 25,000 direct labor hour multiplied by 2, that's 50,000. So 50,000 naira minus 47,000 naira will give you 3,000. So that's 47 as our actual, remember, and then 25,000 direct labor hours. So we come back to what we have in here. So 50,000 minus 47,000, that will give you 3,000. In the same vein, remember our overhead absorption rate is 2 naira. So you're going to multiply 2 naira by 21,500 as the direct labor hour for the scenario 2. That'll give for 3,000 naira. So under absorption is what you're going to be having there, because you have 50,000 as our overheads. Okay, and then this is the actual that you have been absorbed. So here you're going to be having 43 minus 50,000, and that will fetch you 47,000 under, because our actual overhead cost is 50,000. So the actual overhead cost minus the absorbed overhead cost, that will fetch you this figure of 50,000. So now let's look at the absorbed overhead for scenario 3. Absorbed overhead for activity level 21,500 direct labor hours, that we're going to multiply 21,500 by 2 naira, and then here you arrive at 43,000 naira. So your overhead absorption, to know whether it's under or over, you're going to deduct the absorbed overhead minus the actual overhead that you have actually incurred. But in this case, we talk about the actual overhead of 47,000. So overhead of 47, this is the absorbed one, 47, and then this is actual. So it means that if here you're going to be having 47,000 as under absorption. So that's how to calculate our overhead. Okay, basically absorption now. So to find out whether a particular overhead has been over or under absorbed, over or under absorbed. So I believe that with all of this, you'll be able to understand, what it means by overhead absorption. Of course, the basis for calculating overhead absorption, and then the different reasons why we have under over absorption, of overheads. And of course, we are also there with some simple questions or illustrative questions now for us to know how to calculate over and under absorption of overhead. So that'll bring us to the end of this particular part of our discourse on overheads. And I want to believe that you have learned one or two things. I have understood, all that we have set out to accomplish, even here today. So once again, I want to appreciate you for joining, this particular lecture, or, watching this particular video. Once again, subscribe. I want to implore you subscribe. If you have benefited, or if you have learned one or two things, subscribe to it so that you can actually be part of the next video that will be released on this particular topic or other topics to come. So thank you very much. I appreciate all of you. Bye for now.